And it is my great pleasure to reintroduce many familiar names. It's our guest of honor, Darcie Little Badger.
Hello.
And of course, Connie Willis and Arkady Martin, who are recurring honored guests as well. And we are hoping to hear about how you will create worlds beyond our kind of taken for granted lived realities. And I have this whole series of questions I can ask you, but really that's kind of the title of our panel is our opening question. So in all of your works, you talk about, you kind of challenge our taken for granted realities. You talk about permeable boundaries between worlds, actual intergalactic travel, familiarizing or defamiliarizing aspects of our contemporary world. I'm hoping you could just kind of speak to how you encourage readers to think beyond their lived experience.
Let's see. Well, I think for me, one of the things is that I want to create worlds that are different, but not so different that we can't connect to them, that we don't have some point of connection. And so when I've written about, like I wrote a novel about near-death experiences, and I actually had people experiencing things after death. Something I, by the way, don't believe in, but that's why they call it science fiction. But that is such a strange, and I wanted to create a really strange, sort of surreal reality in the parts of the book that were about these near-death experiences. So that meant that I felt that I had to really make the real parts of the book as accurate and down to earth as possible. Because if I made the real parts, which took place in a hospital with hospital staff and researchers and so on, if I didn't make that super concrete and super real, it would all just be sort of floating in space. You know, you wouldn't have anything to connect to. And then when I went into the near-death experiences, it would just be even less connected, and you would not have anything to hang on to. So I think whenever you're creating a world or a time or a place that people have not been, you really have to work to make it to make sure that the reader can connect either with the characters or with the situation or with the place, and recognize as much as they possibly can so that you can then lead them other places. That's real garbled. I'm sorry. It's late afternoon.
I have to say, I definitely connect with what Connie's saying, that all three of my books and many of my short stories take place in Texas with people who live in a world very much like ours, with the exception of A Snake Falls to Earth, where half of the cast is human and lives in Texas. The other half are animal people from a completely invented world. But even the worlds that I invent, they have ecologies that are reminiscent of ours. And so I start with this seed of just my lived experiences and those of the people around me, and just from there elaborate, how can we make things a little bit stranger? What would happen if maybe there were fairy rings that could transport people? How would that impact the world we know as it stands today? And then from there, just almost like riffing on the concept, whatever sort of theme. If it's a horror story where there's ghosts, I'd be, well, how would we actually react to that? So it is very much based in especially the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
So the characters, they are going through things that are very much related to, inspired by stuff that any of us might be going through, just so readers can have that connection, like you say, and relate to, even if they're in alien planets, like they're still worried about things like love and emails.
My favorite fan letter I ever got about A Memory Called Empire was about the chapter that basically starts with my protagonist, Mahid, realizing that because she had sent a bunch of what is functionally email the night before, she has now woken up to her inbox being full of what is functionally email. And I mean, like, it's all fancy science fiction.
8,000 emails.
It's like cool little world-building things, little infofiche sticks you break open, and it's like a virtual email is here for you. But I figured that, that is a universally frustrating and somewhat horrific experience that nearly everyone living in the modern world has had at least once, which is I did one step in this long process, but now other people have responded to me and it's not over. And the lovely thing about science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction in general is that we get to do what Darcie was describing, which is to ask a what if question and then spin a world from that. And it can be a sentence length what if question, like what if there were fairy rings that, and it can be a really big, like technological what if question, like what if artificial intelligence, or it can be a really big societal what if question. I love those personally myself because it comes from my training as being a historian and now working in policy. Like I love like, what if there was a way of having institutional memory that really worked, but it would cause all these other problems. And like, that's half of why I wrote memory, like, because I was really interested in that question. But they come from these little seeds that are very familiar and very like askable questions. And I feel like when I'm building a world, I'm a very organic world builder. I build for tone and feel more than, I want the rigorous structure after, but it's like, what rigorous structure do I need to get the tone and feel that I want? But that's there so that my reader can walk into it and feel like they are present and that experiences they have had are parallel to experiences that the people in this world where something else is true have. Right, it's kind of long-winded, but okay.
No, and you can have a really elaborate, different, super different world, like the world in Dune, for instance. It's got different history, it's got different religion, it's got a different ecology, it's got creatures, it's got all this stuff. However, it also has kids who are expected to grow up to be one thing, who really don't want to be that thing. And you have jealousies in the religious structure, and you have jealousies in the political structure, and you have good guys and bad guys and people trying to get power and competing for all. That is all super familiar. And so that grounds you when you're trying to deal with the Bene Gesserit and the sandworms and the spice and the blue eyes and all that stuff, because it's all familiar territory. If Herbert had also said, okay, I'm going to do this bizarre world, and then I'm also going to have people who react in completely different ways. Humans react. You would just be lost. You would be so lost that you wouldn't have any way to ground yourself. And I don't think you'd read the book,
Or you might try and stop.
Right, exactly, which is way worse. So, yeah.
Moderator time.
Well, the problem is the way you beautifully answer questions, you sort of answer a lot of them partially.
Sorry.
So, but what do you all see as the main challenges that your work poses to audience views, like, or our experiences of the world? Where are you trying to push us? Or are you not, and you're just having fun in your world beyond?
I'm not enormously kind to my audience. I expect a lot from them. And that was a decision I made pretty early on as a writer, that that's the kind of writer I was gonna be. That sometimes it might not be super accessible, but that was something I was gonna be okay with, and hopefully enough of the audience would also be okay with it. Turns out that seems to be true. I guess in terms of like world building, and I want to think about in my stories. I don't always think about what I want the audience to think about. I want to think about what I want to spend a while doing art about, I guess. Something I care about. With memory, it was a lot about imperialism and assimilation, and institutional memory. With the book that just came out this year, Rose House, it's a lot about arch and legacy and really bad mentorship relationships, and also like why horror is sexy or not. And then I hope that the world I've built is enough of an invitation that my audience can also get to think about those things. And they may think about them differently than me because that's what art's for. I hope they do.
Yeah, I'll say that this is just from feedback in general. In two of my books, at least, Lazzo and Shenelende, there are these weird things that exist in the world like ours, and people just accept that they're real. And a lot of times, people who read the book come up to me and be like, yeah, I'm so used to the main character having to hide the fact that there's a monster living under their bed, or whatever the case might be. But in these books, everyone knows that Ellie can raise the ghosts of animals and has a ghost dog. And it's just something that they kind of adapt to and acknowledge is real. And so I didn't realize when I was writing it that would be, if not really challenging, but different from expectations when it comes to this sort of story. But I think it's kind of cool that I get to just think like, I often think it's just such a big hassle to keep things like that secret. Like there would, especially with phones, people would be taking photos and recording, and there wouldn't just be like blurry photos of Bigfoot walking through the forest. There'd be like Bigfoots, they'd probably collect their hair, and I don't know, do a whole bunch of evidence for Bigfoot. So I was like, yeah, it's easier for me just to assume that people acknowledge what exists in front of their eyes and what their senses are telling them, than being like, oh, the main character is going to do this whole like plot to keep her ghost dog secret. I was like, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I would say in my time travel novels, the most challenging part is the past is a different place. They do things differently there, to quote a famous person. And they think differently. That's the weirdest thing. And so you have to be true to that, but you also, like I said before, you've got to have these points of connection. And with my time travelers, I'm really lucky because they come from a future, so they represent that point of view. Then you have the present of the reader, and then you have the past, which the time traveler goes to. So you get this parallax vision of the world and how it would work in different times and places. But I read a book one time about a quite famous book, part of a trilogy, not genre, mainstream, about the opening of the West. And the first volume was about the trappers, and the second volume was about the pioneers and so on. But the trapper one, I considered to be a failed book. I'm sure he was absolutely right in everything he said about what the world was like then. It was just too alien. It was so alien. His attitudes toward Native Americans, his attitudes toward animals, his attitude toward the world, there were no points of connection. There were no points of sympathy. There was nothing you could grab onto and say, yeah, but he's still human, because he just seemed not human. He just didn't share any of the attitudes. And I was like, that's the danger that you get into if you're absolutely true to an era. Because like I was writing a doomsday book about the Middle Ages, which is a long time ago, and a very different world, a very different worldview about religion, a very different worldview about politics and marriage and class hierarchies and all those things. And so in one way, it's helpful to have a time traveler because she can say, isn't this weird? This is so weird. I don't feel this way. But on the other hand, you also want to make the characters in that time human and relatable, but you can't do that by making them modern. So like I always call that, it's too long ago now, but I used to call it the Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. Because it was such a terrible, terrible show because they were wearing all the right clothes, they had all the right guns, it was supposed to be set in pioneer days. They had all the right, all the mechanics part of the story was very true to the West. Everything except the attitudes of people. They were super inclusive. Nobody was racist at all. Women could do whatever they wanted. I'm like, this never happened in the West. This is not true. And it was just so maddening because you had these 21st century attitudes And then at the same time, you were trying to pretend that this is how the West was. Just didn't work. So, but if you get it too far this way, your readers can't relate. If you get it too far that way, they're like, no way. And so you really kind of, it's a tricky balancing act. But I think that's true. It's not just true of time travel. I think it's true of like planets and aliens. It's true of ghosts. It's true of whatever you're doing. It's a tightrope that you're walking.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys are welcome to, just respond to each other also. Because actually one of my questions is about how you navigate that hybridity of known and familiar, mundane, but also mystical, supernatural, otherworldly. And you make aliens very relatable, and yet they're so different in these encounters.
I learned from some really
ghosts.
skilled people. Like I feel like I have yet to get as good as the people I'm trying to get to. My favorite aliens and humans together book is probably by C.J. Cherry's The Foreigner series, where functionally, and there's like 20 some books, but you really only need 6. Functionally, you've got like a human ambassador, you'll notice some similarities here, who has got to, for various complex reasons, go live amongst a group of aliens. And the planet belongs to the aliens, and it is their culture, and they do not have either the same emotional, physical, or instinctive reactions that humans do, despite being sapient, cultured, technological, political, etc. And the entirety of the first couple of books of this series is about showing how alien these aliens are by having our human protagonist make mistakes about what he thinks their motivation should be. Because he thinks that surely they must have motivations that are comprehensible to him. But they are not comprehensible to him because they are not human. And those mistakes have political and plot consequences for him. And he learns, but he doesn't get it. And then you, the reader, get to get it a little bit because the gap is demonstrated in the book. And I love that. And I have tried to, when I make really alien things, give an example of why their alienness is a problem for someone who isn't as alien.
Yeah, I was just trying to think. I recently wrote a short story for Revolutions of the Heart, which is like an anthology inspired by Ursula Le Guin. And in this, I just love the way that she's able to make these alien societies where I felt like I was immersed within them and I understood them, even though they were different from the one I grew up in. So I like you say, with inspiration, just thinking about that had me trying to write my own. I was like, what if there were this planet where I don't know I'll just describe the story. It's not like it's a big secret. But they live underground. Above ground, there's this predatory creature, but it only hunts flocks or packs or groups. So if a person is alone, they're fine. But as soon as they group up with another person, then they're in danger. So I how would people survive in cave-like systems? And then for that, I turned to the biology of animals that actually do live within caves, fish that spend their whole lives in darkness and just evolve in order to adapt to that. So like finding inspiration from nature as a scientist is huge.
And finding inspiration from history, because history is full of tons of examples of how people act in bizarre and different situations and in cultures that are very, very different from yours, and they were all humans, although it's hard to believe that some of them were in the past. It's hard to believe that some of them are right now. But I can think of one. But it's just, looking at all these examples of this is how this worked out, and this is how people behave in this situation. And when you truly believe that one class should be the ruling class and everybody else should be subservient to that, what are all the ramifications of that? And you don't have to make this up. You can just go read a book about the Wars of the Roses or a book about medieval England or whatever. There are just tons of examples all over the place, and you can look to those, and then because they're real, that gives a verisimilitude to what you're doing too. You know, you're like, it feels right because these are actual examples of human behavior through time.
Yeah, I love that we all have like our own like background of scholarly, different interests that we have, and all like weaving them into
I feel
fiction.
like that's like a thing that people who do a lot of world building tend to have, whether it's formal or informal, like a deep interest in learning about some of the ways the world works.
Yeah, I did like a whole like even. I just think of all the pockets of society that I don't know about. Like, I really want to know about what it'd be like to be a stage magician, because I'm writing an adult book that involves a character who is in that world. So like straight up, I went and took like magic lessons from these seasoned professionals who work at the Magic Castle in Los Angeles.
Incredibly cool, actually.
They make you like, you have to wear like a tuxedo or a fancy dress to go in there. No pictures. It's all very secretive. And they're like, within this room, you can practice magic, but once you step beyond this room, you must not. It's magicians only. And so it was fun, but also it's fascinating just how much you can learn just by doing these new experiences. I feel like a lot of my science was like that. I'd read articles that weren't necessarily connected to plankton genetics, but yeah, like there are pockets of water that, because of just their density, they've been trapped in caves in the bottom of the ocean for centuries and millennia, and like you can see what the world was like by sampling this water. And I was like, whoa, that's so cool. Probably do that on other planets.
Oh, yes,
Well, and your things are the things that make you unique as a writer, and that make your voice different from every other voice in the world. And I remember at a lectureship here, Greg Bear was here, and Greg Benford. Two of the terrible bees, the big bees. And they were like, we were talking, and they said, well, I'm writing, what's your new novel about? Well, it's about robots. Well, mine's about robots too. And I said, oh, I'm writing a short story about robots. And they immediately said, what's yours about? And I'm like, mine is nothing like yours, obviously. And then, because Greg Bear always did all these things with super technological, biological things, and Greg Benford always did the physicist type stuff, and I'm like, don't. And they said, no, we want to know. We don't want to all come out with the same robot story. And I didn't want to tell them, and then I finally said, okay, well, mine is about a robot who wants to be a rocket. And they both turned and walked away. And I'm like, I told you. But I know about the Rockettes.
I want to know about a robot who wants to be a rocket. Like, again, it's that, this is the gift of writing genre, is you get to ask that question.
Right.
And spin the whole world from that question.
Right. And it wasn't, and for me, it was like, I was at the Rockettes. I saw the Rockettes Christmas show, and I'm sitting there, and they're doing that tin soldier number, the super regimented, and I'm watching that, and I was like, if I was a robot, that's what I wanted. And then I was like, wow, maybe I could do that. But I always said that I felt my success in science fiction was because I was a housewife with a small child, and I sang in a church choir. And so I had all these alien worlds that I had explored. There is no more alien world than a church choir, unless you have been to a Tupperware party. And then you have achieved worlds of oddness that no one else knows about. And I've written about all those things, and nobody else has. And I'm sure Greg Bear and Greg Benford will walk away in disgust. But I feel like everybody brings their own experience, and it's their own experience and their own interests, and that's what you bring every time you write a story, whether you're writing about other planets or you're writing about robots or you're writing about whatever, you're bringing those life experiences with you.
Absolutely do. There was like a whole year sort of not this year, but the year before, where I didn't really write a whole lot because it turned out that my life had turned into plot too much because I was doing all the work that I normally do on narrative at my day job because I was working in politics.
Oh.
And
Oh.
yeah. So and in an area I do clean energy policy, but I was at the time sort of either the third or the second in command of a state agency, which meant I was doing a lot of really sort of like figuring out people's motivations and why they did things and how could I make them do other things. And then I looked up and I was like, I have written no plot because I've used that muscle all day today. I think probably my writing now will be more interesting because I've done that. But it
Not
was a
at the
very
same time.
interesting experience to realize like, yeah, all right.
Yeah,
Your
and
characters have so much political intrigue. That makes sense.
it's, well, and the one thing I would add to that is that you should never worry about, like, there's some people, if you wanna write, you need to devote your entire life to writing. You must write. That can be the only thing in your life. Write. And it's not true, because then you'll write about a writer and how they got a rejection letter. That's like, it's all you know, so that's what you write. But the truth is, it's all your other experiences, your relationships, your friendships, your hobbies, the TV shows you watch, whatever it is. It's all going into the, I guess Mark Twain called it the well. And you have to fill up the well, and you can't write because you write and then the well kind of, you use up all the water, and then you have to wait for the well to fill up again before you can write again. And I have a feeling that's what was happening.
Yeah, it was very much, it was, I switched jobs because I still work in the same area, but it's a lot less intense and it's a lot less hands-on most of the time. And part of that was I really like writing and I didn't have the same access to that ability to generate that I did.
Right.
Before I was using that ability for something else.
It's kind of funny you mentioned writing nothing but writers, because I was recently talking to someone who is taking pitches for comic series. And they expressed to me that they're like, oh, thank goodness you didn't send me a story about a writer. Because
Yeah,
like the
it's
number
true.
one.
It's so true.
They're like, we get way too many pitches where it's a writer. I was like, I enjoy stories about writers. I can't write one because I'd be like, I can't stand living in this characters. I need to do something interesting. It's weird, like I do actually like reading other people's takes on what it's like to be a writer, especially because I do find that they differ from mine and among. But yeah, no, me myself, I don't want to write about Darcie. I was like, Darcie gets enough time in my head.
Well, and the common pattern for mainstream writers is their first novel is about their growing up in Appalachia with, some bizarre situation. And it's very rich in debt. And then their second novel is about a writer who made it big with his first novel and is now attending all these cocktail parties.
And their third novel is about how they got divorced.
Yes, that's right, exactly. Which is at least more interesting than their second novel. So, yeah.
We're about halfway through our allotted time, and if we have audience questions, please feel free. Ask away.
We're not leaving,
About the
so
world.
might as well ask. All right.
I was just wondering, do you find like if you're approaching like the real world, but versus like a completely made up world, do you find one more intimidating or more difficult than the other? Or do you have a preference?
Writing near future science fiction is horrific and I don't want to do it anymore. And I it's really hard. And it's hard in a way that I found, there are great things about writing that because you get to use all of the connotative reference that is in the world and make up new bits. And that part is wonderful. But the weight of feeling like you have to accurately predict how things will go, I do not really enjoy, I have discovered.
And you're always wrong,
Yeah.
too. I mean, that's the worst part, is that you often, when I wrote Crosstalk, it was set in the real world, and my heroine became telepathic accidentally. And I was like, okay, so I was trying to talk about celebrities, and I was like, okay, what couple has not gotten divorced and will not get divorced?
Oh,
And,
oh no.
and I was like, well, gee, I can't remember who the couple was, but they, you know, they'd been together a long time in Hollywood terms. And I was like, I guess I can use them. 2 weeks before the novel came out, they broke up in this huge splashy breakup, and I was like, oh crud, you can't guess, right? You're always wrong about what might happen, and you can't fix that. It's too late because the book's already gone to press, and there you are with your mistake. But yeah, and it's maddening because I think it's the equivalent of when you see in movies, any movie that was made the past 20 years, the phones are ridiculous, you know, and they continue to get ridiculous. I mean, the smartphones we're all holding right now will be ridiculous in 5 years' time, and then 5 years after that. And so you're constantly dealing with a totally changing world, which you can't go back and fix, and which you're wrong about everything that's going to happen. So
Yeah, I've decided that all future books that I write that have a connection to the real world have to happen at least like far enough in the future that I don't have to draw the lines of continuity.
Yeah.
I can just like, we're here now. Things happened. Now this.
I do find it amusing. Sometimes I read a story where, like, for this anthology I was doing, it takes place like 500 years in the future, and they're like the ancient texts of res dogs from Willis. And I was like, would they really remember that? I don't know. Let's say they do. But yeah, I'd say that when I write a world that is not, you know, based on ours, whether it's on a different planet or a fantasy construction, it almost feels like it's more freeing, but also I don't have as much to lean back on. I have to create a lot more, and of course I'm inspired by what I know, but it's the type of thing where I really need to keep track of everything that I decide is the case for that world, because if I forget, then it's not like I can just refer to Wikipedia. So.
Mary, did you have a question?
Sure. No, I was thinking about what Connie had said about in time travel. If you go back really far, you have to kind of make those people not seem so alien and not real. And one of the moments that impressed me a lot in Kindred, for example, was the fact that we all think about antebellum South and, oh God, that's so alien way to think about things. But when her husband gets stuck there and then comes back, it's kind of reminds me of today when we think about, oh, how did that Nazism thing ever occur? How do people buy into it? And here we go.
Yeah.
You know, it kind of takes that historical moment. I think it's easier to go back to history because it did happen. And that seems so alien to us now, and says, well, yeah, there's a path towards buying into those things that seem alien to us now. And I wonder if any of your time travel novels, do you think about that, how to make what, for example, the plague, when you're talking about the plague, making that relatable so that people nowadays can think about why people were motivated to
do what they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wrote Doomsday Book before the pandemic, and I have two plagues. I have the bubonic plague happening in the Middle Ages, which is really well documented, and then I have the 1918 Spanish flu, which also very well documented. And I basically used those two for my research for my two pandemics that are going on in the novel. I got the toilet paper right. I was very proud of it. Very proud of getting the toilet paper shortage right. And everyone's like, how did you get that right? Oh, how did you know? Of course, I didn't know. I just was like, well, I bet there'll be shortages, and boy, that's the one that would bother me. So, but then, a lot of people assume that I wrote that book after the pandemic, and I didn't, but I was just trying to think, what would this be like, and how do people? And I had lots and lots of examples of how people did react to the plague and how they did react to the Spanish flu. So I was able to, plus I'm old enough that I lived through the polio summer where, there were all these restrictions on you and you couldn't swim and you couldn't do this and you weren't allowed to play with friends and you knew somebody in an iron lung and all those things. And so that helped me too. But I was just guessing. I mean, and that's, you can guess wrong, and that's, if you guess wrong, then you guess wrong. But guessing though, I shouldn't say guessing. I was just extrapolating. Extrapolating is not guessing. Guessing is, I don't know, it'll come up at 3 or a 4. Extrapolating is, okay, well, I've seen this and this and this, and they went this way. So I'm gonna assume that this will go this way. And extrapolation can be, I think that science fiction writers have a pretty good record of extrapolating the future. They get some things wrong, but they get others. Like Heinlein extrapolated the credit card in like 1950 in one of his novels and stuff. So, and the microwave. But then he had everybody traveling on rolling roads and there were no cars. So, you get some right, you get some wrong. So. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did have a question or a comment. I apologize if my hand was a little bit. No, what you said actually reminded me of, and the whole story or the whole thing about getting something wrong or getting something right actually reminded me also of when in Kay Jemisin, she wrote her one urban fantasy that was in New York City about a magical virus, and I don't think she planned for COVID-19 to have happened because it was like, everything was done like a year before it gets out, right?
Right.
But it was like days after that novel got out, New York City got, the pandemic. Got hit by the pandemic.
Yeah.
I don't know how I'd feel if that happened to me.
You caused it. You would think you caused it.
Yeah, or like you summoned it.
Right, yeah.
Well, you know them coming to the sunflowers. I mean,
That'd be nice. I hope that does happen.
The worst example I ever saw was, now I can't think of his name, but a famous science fiction writer, Norman Spinrad. And he wrote a book about the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was before the Soviet Union collapsed. And he wrote about it, and on the cover of the book was that famous statue of Lenin, but it had a bird's nest in its hair and it had ivy twined all around it, as though it were completely forgotten and all that was in the past. And then he had done this story about not how the Soviet Union had collapsed, but how it had gradually, due to détente, gradually opened up as a society. The day the book came out,
Oh my God.
that statue was on the ground and the wall was down and his novel went nowhere
Oh,
because he guessed wrong. And his extrapolation was perfect. I mean, he really did a good job. It didn't match.
There's a point
What
at which, you can extrapolate that it is history that throws the dice.
Right.
And then we're all just along the ride a little bit.
Right. What an awful person to have his cell phone. That's my husband.
The thing that you do catch sometimes is when someone has done most of the world building, but not all of it. And I will use a non-speculative genre example. I love these books. They are mystery novels. They're by Carol O'Connell. They have a protagonist named Kathy Mallory. They're sort of crime procedural gothic, but they're set in New York City. And I love them, and they're like super over the top and wonderful. But Carol O'Connell, bless her heart, has never ridden the subway and doesn't understand who does. I'm a New Yorker. It's like she's been to New York. She has done her research. She understands what it feels like. She's been to the kind of weird art party that she describes in one of these books. But no one in her books ever takes the subway. They all drive. They drive. And there's only one of them who should be driving because one of them is annoyingly rich.
Yeah.
And therefore that guy, he definitely is going to drive.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody else is going to take the subway. And they all just don't. And if I ever meet her, I'm going to have to ask that question. I mean, after like the sort of gushing praise, because
Yes.
I love these books. And I think they pull off things that no one has any right to be able to pull off, which is a delight. But it's not, have you been? Did you take this? Yeah, anyway. So I think, I sometimes think about this as like a cautionary tale for myself. Like I can think I know a lot of things, but I probably don't know a thing I should know.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm writing even a little bit outside my own experience. And as a speculative fiction writer, you write outside your own experience a whole lot.
That's why I cheat and like all my books, I'm like, this takes place in an alternate universe, so I
Get it wrong, it's just because
Yeah.
it's
It's
different over
alternate.
there.
yeah, that's how
Far
they
Nice
make
future
it.
say.
science fiction, no
Yeah,
problem.
but yeah, no, it's
No, that's
different.
good, that's a good save, and so is Archimedes, setting it far enough in the future that all these things happen and then here we are. Cause,
Was there an Earth? Does
right.
it matter?
Well, in each of your works, whether, in all of the various futurisms, near or far, you're dealing with a lot of really important, like, social and political questions about empire, about indigenous futures and homecoming and dispossession and kind of like trying to reclaim spaces. Are these messages built into your worlds? Like, I mean, I'm sure they are, I know they're purposeful, but like what kinds of messages are you trying to kind of build into these worlds beyond that you're encouraging us to see?
I definitely think that a theme in all of my books, which I do write for young adults, but I don't think it would change because I'm working on a couple of adult projects now. And of course, I've written a lot of short stories for adults, but is this theme of hope, but not in a way where it's naive, but more so in that I'm writing about people and communities from groups that have been through a lot of struggles, particularly over the process of colonization and the world as it exists now, which is still not great for the lip-on. It's pretty bad, but we're making slow progress. So I don't want readers, especially Native readers, to come away from this with a sense that they have no future, just because they hear that so much, potentially within their own lives. And that crushing despair, if we give up hope, then there's nothing to fuel our fight going forward for the younger generations and those who have not yet been born. And there's nothing to push us to keep living. And just being aware of, like, oftentimes there's a high rate of mental health crises in our communities. So I was like, I want my books not to be naively optimistic, but to be, who said it? Where it's like, was it you, Connie, who said like realistically optimistic, or that was you? Yeah. So, and hopeful in the way where I don't want them to think there's no future at all. So like, no matter what I write, I will always have an ending that pushes that forward, even if characters do go through tragedy and do have loss and stuff. That hope is a recurring theme. But other than that, my worlds tend to be very different, depending on my whims.
I think there's like, I could answer this in two different ways, and one of them is like pretty technical. Like I want to be able to ask a particular kind of question about empire. Like the world of Tixkalami is basically 11th century Byzantium and Armenia, and to set that up with, and also faster than light travel, I had to build some pretty strong restrictions into the world itself to create the societal situation I wanted to talk about like a place where you could feel like the assimilation that was happening to your culture was mostly cultural, but with a military threat behind it, but not an imminent one. And that it's possible to make a journey to the center of the empire, but it's arduous and causes communication breakdown. If you just are operating on like everybody has an Ansible and can do fast and like, and everybody has got like warp drive, that all breaks and the story I wanted to tell wouldn't work. So I had to do a lot of world design that allowed the story to happen the way I wanted it to. But that's sort of a technical craft thing. And it's sort of, I sometimes talk about, I do world building backwards. I decide how I want it to be and then what has to be true to make that be true. But in terms of message, It depends on the book a lot. But one of the things that I have run into and believe, because I am a historian, because I am a person who has done politics, who does policy work, is that the shape of the world is very open-ended. And individual lives and arcs are very powerful, but also limited in scope. So I think sometimes people find the endings of my books like not closed. I leave things open because the world is very long. And that's very much on purpose.
Okay, well, I would say the thing that all of my books have in common, which I've written about a lot of different things, and I read a lot of comedies, and they all have happy endings. And some of my other books have happy endings too. But I think the thing that all my characters share in all my books, no matter what they're about, is that there are good people trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that they didn't want, did not sign on for, do not have enough, and they're trying to make good decisions and they don't have enough information. And there is no way for them to get enough information. And so they are flying blind. And I consider that the human condition. I mean, that to me is the basic reality of life, is you never have enough information to make these decisions. And yet the decisions are so important. And if you get it wrong, it's like majorly bad, but you still do not have enough information. And so I think that I consider that a universal message, and it makes it easier for me then when I'm writing, is that that's always the message of my stories, whether it's a comedy and they're trying to figure out what the heck the bishop's bird stump is and where it is and why it's important and how it got there and what's going on. And I also handicap my characters a lot. Ned, to say nothing of the dog, is badly time lagged. And so they're like being a little woozy and hungover and not really making good decisions and not capable of making good decisions. And yet in a situation where he has to. Kivrin, I think, is sick when she gets sick when she first goes to the past in Doomsday Book. And then of course in my two World War II books, the Blackout and All Clear, they've signed on for a 3-week, 6-week, practicum, and then the drop won't open and they're all stuck there for the duration of the war. And they only know where the bombs are falling for the duration of their practicum, and the practicum's over. And now they don't know anything. And they didn't sign on for this, and they didn't research this part, and they don't know where the bombs are gonna fall, and they don't know what they're supposed to be doing something, and they have no idea what that something is. But if they guess wrong, Hitler will win the war. So I like stacking the deck against my characters quite a bit, but not, because I think that is the human condition. But I don't want to burden. Somebody said, I just try and make my characters, I just try to punish them as much as possible. The worst things you can do for them, to them, is the better. And I'm like, what? What kind of sadist are you, for heaven's sake? I mean, it is true that your characters, you have to do bad things to your characters. That is true. And it's definitely true that you have to do worse things to your characters in comedies than you do in dramas. Things because you have to humiliate them, you have to, embarrass them, you have to screw them up badly. But I think cruelty to you want them to come through. I always want my characters to come through okay, whether they're going to or not. And those, I think, that's sort of the underpinnings, whether I'm doing aliens in Roswell or I'm doing time travel to the Middle Ages, or I'm doing near-death experiences or telepathy or Hollywood in the future or alien planets and stuff. And I think that kind of helps me because it's sort of a through line for all my work. So.
Thank you. Do we have other audience questions? We have 10 more minutes.
Oh, and can I say one quick thing? And I do not sit down and say, I'm going to write a story with a through line of this. You figure this out as you go and you figure it out afterwards. I mean, it's like well, somebody asked me one time, so about the theme. So like, do you put the theme in at the beginning or do you add it on top later? I'm like, that isn't how this works. This isn't how any of this works.
But just to be argumentative, I am sometimes the person who's like, I'm gonna write a story about this thing.
Yes, yes, yes.
The
But do
problem
you
is it
end
doesn't
up,
always work.
but do you end up at the same place thinking about it as you do it at the beginning?
No, the reason
Yeah.
I'm writing about that thing is because I wanna think about it.
Exactly, exactly.
How do you ensure that there's enough connections in a completely fantastical world?
That's a good question. One thing that helps is if I want a reader's perspective, I get someone else to read it. Like, and that way I usually ask like, was this confusing? Because usually there's like certain scenes where I think there might be there might be a loss, something lost in translation between what I intended and what the reader's picking up. So I will ask like specifically, did this come through? Usually if I get my mom to read it, she'll just say she likes it. So I have to get someone who's gonna be honest with me. So I'll get my spouse.
So true.
Who literally cannot lie.
I'm going to embarrass mine now. So the woman in the red blazer back there is my
Who's
wife.
hiding? Who's trying to hide?
And she is the person who I ask that question of, did I make this make sense? Because it is the hardest thing for me is to get out of what made sense to me as a writer and get it to a place where it could conceivably make sense to other people.
And that's because the story in your head is not necessarily the story that makes it
Exactly,
to the
the one that's
paper.
on the paper.
Yeah.
Or I've written something that doesn't have enough, usually it doesn't have enough. Like I've done all the poetry and none of the substance. My constant battle is to actually put content on the page and not just things that make people feel a way. So I mean, like I'm working on I'm writing a fantasy novel for like the first time in my life, which is interesting. And therefore I'm doing magic systems for the first time. At novel length, I've done it at short fiction length. And I handed her the first chapter and I was like, do you know how the magic works enough that you don't want to like throw the book across the room? It's only 5,000 words so far, so it's okay if you don't really get it, but like, is it enough? Did I put enough structure? Did I tell the reader what's happening for real? And the answer is usually no, but, which is kind of great actually,
That's
because
always the
then
answer.
she can tell me what I didn't do, and usually I can go do it, it works. But a friend, a mentor, another writer, someone you trust in terms of their ability to read, which is different from someone you like hanging out with or trust to read your work. So.
I always ask who is the sane center, if I'm writing a comedy, who is the sane center of this story? So there's all this madness going on, there's all these quirky characters, there's all this crazy behavior. Is there somebody at the center? Jimmy Stewart, he used to be always the sane center in comedies. And he would be the one who was representative of the reader's or the viewer's viewpoint. So he's looking at the madness, and when somebody says something finally sensible, it's him. And when somebody sees right through to what's really going on, it's him. And when somebody says what you have been thinking in your head as the reader or the viewer, it's him. And that is essential, I think, in stories. And the crazier the story, the more essential it is. By crazy, I mean, strange worlds, fantasies, things. The more essential it is to have, if not a sane center, someone who speaks for the reader. Someone who's looking at this and going, this is nuts. Or I don't understand this part. And they're voicing what you would be voicing if you were reading this. You would be asking that question. And so you need somebody that can, because they give you an entry point into all the madness and into all the detail that you don't understand and into this bizarre, complicated world of Dune or whatever. They're the one who gives you an entry point. If you don't have an entry point, then I think the connections are not strong enough.
I'll ask a really quick one. Do you guys have favorite worlds from other writers that you just like?
Oh, God, yeah.
That's a one that I always go back to. I love that world. That's the world I would love to be in.
See, I was with you right up until the last,
You
the
know,
last,
there.
because I was gonna say, oh yeah, Max Gladstone's craft sequence, I'm like, nope,
Don't
nope,
have
I
to
do
be
not
there,
live
don't
there.
have to be
That
in
is
it, but
not-
just like somebody really, this is a world that I love this world.
Yeah. I mean, genuinely, I love Max Gladstone's craft sequence books. They are super, super cool. They are sort of second world fantasy where the magic system is kind of like the stock market and weird banking with gods. And like fancy, horrible financial shenanigans, but magic. And it's awesome. And they're wonderful.
What was the name again?
Max Gladstone is the writer, and the first book is called 3 Parts Dead. Mhm.
I mean, I like the world of what we do in the shadows. I think that's like, I would want to be a werewolf if I had to like choose between vampires and werewolves. I'd want to be in a little pack with my werewolves, not swearwolves, but probably I'd just be a human. I have to remind myself of that. But even like I watch Wellington Paranormal, which takes place in the world and like expands upon it. There's so many weird little quirky things, but the people, the way they just like deadpan through the whole thing, it cracks me up. But yeah, I don't know. I just think it's a nice place, unless you're a victim of the vampire, which then it's not so nice. Yeah, and then you're dead.
Yeah, well, the only question I got right on the trivia quest test today was the one about the Princess Bride. And I love that, except for the dying heart. And I would not want to be on the receiving end of the, my name is Inigo Montoya, and my father prepared to die. But other than that, it's just such a charming fantasy world, and one that I love to live in.
Well, thank you all so much. We're at 5:07, so you guys have 3 extra minutes. Yeah, if you want to eat your cookies.
Can we also give it one more thing that one more fantasy or
Sure.
world that we'd like?
Sure.
I always recommend this because it's not very well known now, but Peter Beagle's Fine and Private Place. It was the first novel he wrote. It will make you sick to your stomach because he was 21 and it's brilliant.
I didn't know he was 21.
He was 21. Isn't that disgusting? I know. It's a perfect novel. And he says he paid for it later because then he didn't know how to, he's like a wild young pitcher. He didn't know how to do it again. And it took him 20 years to figure out how to do it again. But the fact is he wrote this perfect novel when he was 21. And it's set in a cemetery in New Jersey. And it's all about the dead in New Jersey. And it's just, I was almost gonna say that was my favorite fantasy world to live in, even though it's mostly the real world, except with
Also
ghosts.
in New
With
Jersey.
ghosts. And it's in New Jersey, but it's in a graveyard in New Jersey, so it's okay.
Author's name?
Peter Beagle, and it's called A Fine and Private Place. Just a charming novel. Do you guys have other?
Oh, God.
Some of them I'm like, I don't want to say that because like it's like super edgy and for a child, like growing up, I used to be really into like Invader Zim and stuff like that. That's like
yeah.
if I actually lived in that world, I hate it.
Yes, but you know,
It's so wacky.
I love Zim very much, so yay. I don't often think about living in the other worlds. I don't know. For someone who started reading fantasy and science fiction before I could myself read, it was read to me. The portal fantasy stuff was not the fantasy I had. For me, it was more I would be this character and then I would do it differently or I would do it the same. Like the sort of, the dissolve of self into the narrative, which probably says something weird about my psychology as a small child. But I loved very, very much some books by Guy Gabriel Kay, which I read probably too young. Tigana mostly, and also The Lions of Al-Rassan, which is Tigana sort of set in kind of late medieval Italy. And The Lions of Al-Rassan is absolutely, definitely set in, not really, but it is Reconquista Spain. And both of those were, like, I still think about those worlds all the time.
You know, I was just thinking, if you had a good power, would you want to be in the X-Men universe? Because that's what I used to like always imagine myself in, like, you know, in Spider-Man as Spider-Man, or in the X-Men universe as someone with like a really good power. But then I was just thinking, but a lot of these mutants, they had like this issue where they were showing how a lot of them just are really, they're just really impacted by their mutation, and it's not that useful in life, and they're being hunted by everyone. So I'm starting to question, like, when I was a child, I just always assumed that I'd be the hero, the protagonist. I was like, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably just be like living in the sewers and trying not to get caught or something.
Yeah, for sure. We're all the protagonists. Well, everybody, thanks so much. Thank you. We have 9 minutes till your next panel.
Can I see your program for a second?
Oh, there's free out in the hallway.
Yeah.
Yes,
I need
they've
more
got
caffeine in my life.